Zdravo nasite. Hello to everyone in the audience on Zoom. And we were hoping watching live on Facebook, but we'll definitely make sure that this video recording is up on Facebook as well and on YouTube in the next couple of days. Welcome to our virtual conversation on keeping the Macedonian language alive in the diaspora with Christina Kramer, Professor Emerita in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures at the University of Toronto. Christina earned her bachelor's in Russian and comparative literature from Beloit College in Wisconsin and her master's and PhD in Slavic languages and literature from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She joined the University of Toronto faculty in 1986 and was promoted to full professor in 2001. She chaired the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures. In 1999, Christina authored Macedonian, a course for beginning and intermediate students, which later had a second and third edition in 2003 and in 2011. For this book, Christina received the 2006 Book Award from the American Association of Teachers of Slavic and Eastern European Languages for Best Contribution to Language Pedagogy. I've had the privilege of meeting and getting to know Christina through the United Macedonian Diaspora and can honestly say she is not only a personal friend, but a true friend and advocate of the Macedonian people. Christina Kramer is really a synonym for the study of the Macedonian language around the world, and I'm excited we have her with us tonight. Zdravo, Christina, kako misi?
Dobro, hvala. Kako misi?
Odlično, odlično.
Samozarno.
Така е, samozarno. In normal circumstances, Christina and I would be sitting on two sofas in front of a large audience at a UMD Global Conference in Toronto, DC, or Skopje, having a conversation, but during COVID-19, a virtual hour will do. It was a pleasure hosting Christina in DC at least a couple of times at the UMD office and for an event at the Library of Congress for discussions regarding her English language translations of the books by Goce Smilevski and Ambassador Luan Storova. Christina, by the way, is a huge fan of the Macedonian singer Toshe Projevski. Who isn't, right?
I saw him in concert, yes.
Oh, he's unbelievable. I think I saw him in 2003, and may he rest in peace. I remember one of the first in-person encounters with Christina. She hosted me for a luncheon at the University of Toronto, and she gave me a tour of their impressive library, or biblioteca in Macedonian. And at the end, I said "fala," which means thank you. And then I said, oops, sorry, that is Serbian, and corrected myself to say blagodaram. And Christina responds and says, no, hvala is Serbian, fala is Macedonian. So ladies and gentlemen, it's okay to say fala, blagodaram, or spolaiti. Christina, fala for joining us tonight. The video floor is all yours.
Spolaiti. It is a real pleasure to have this honor to get to talk about a topic that's pretty close and dear to my academic interests, my social interests. It's stuff I've thought a lot about. And before I take questions, I'm going to ask your indulgence. I'm going to read a paper for about 15 minutes. I collected a lot of thoughts that I really wanted to get out there today, and I'm a better reader than I am speaker off the cuff. So the first half I'll speak, and then the second half will be off the cuff, and you can tell me which part works better. So this will be about 15 minutes. I kind of want to get us to start thinking about language and diaspora. Because if we want to start thinking about language and what it is we want to teach, the language we want to use, the language we want to expand into new domains, and the language that we want to promote, we need to think about what is the language that we're actually talking about, what it is we're trying to achieve. So to answer these questions, it'll help us to think about language ecology and the way that languages interact, and the relationship between standard language and dialects, spoken language and written language, English and Macedonian in contact, and why we want to promote Macedonian language in diaspora at all, and how this might be done. These are all actually interrelated questions, so before I take your questions, as I said, I'm going to present a somewhat formal, quick overview of these issues and my current thinking on them. And I want to begin to ask the question, so what is a standard language? And why can it be contested when we think we know what a language is? I particularly wanted to contextualize this given the recent and ongoing attacks on the legitimacy of Macedonia and its history, most recently by Bulgaria, but not exclusively. And a quick discussion of standard language is actually a good place to start. Bulgaria has decided to take the moment of this world pandemic to revert to a rather time-worn refrain of Macedonian not existing as a language, or one that was invented in the 1940s. But these claims actually involve wishful thinking, and they ignore the complexities of the way in which dialects and languages emerge over the course of time in different historical and political moments. They ignore the reality of what linguists sometimes call an Ausbau language, that is, languages that have evolved from, for want of a better term, common stuff. So, for example, we speak of Ausbau languages are the related languages of German, Dutch, Frisian, and English, or the continuum of Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish, or the Romance languages of Spanish, Portuguese, Catalan, and Galician. They arise from one source, and over time, distance, and history, they develop into different languages. So such claims ignore that Bulgarian and Macedonian are languages with histories that stretch back in time for centuries to more unified clusters of dialects and ultimately to a reconstructed common Slavic language, which in turn developed from Proto-Indo-European. So for Bulgarians to make these claims, they rely on the tools of, forgive me, fake news, which at their base rely on power relations and the big lie. You know how it goes. Say something loud enough and often enough and have the power to promulgate it, and that lie more mysteriously becomes the truth, and it keeps in the echo chamber coming back at you. So Bulgaria's claim that Standard Macedonian didn't have its roots any earlier than the mid-20th century is actually not linguistics. It's not fact-based. Rather, it's a fantasy based on official dogma about Macedonia and its inhabitants. In the 19th century, as the Ottoman Empire began to contract, new territories began what is truly a complex process of standardizing their languages. It's not magic that makes languages become standardized and get them expanded into different domains, for example, the language of government or religion, home life, education, domains that during the Ottoman period might have been filled by Turkish or Greek. They do not emerge from the primordial mists. Standard languages involve human agency. That human agency creates them, expands them, develops them, and teaches them. And what I mean by create is to find common ground and to unite and find a way to bring different dialect bases together into a unified language. Bulgarian wasn't codified until the latter half of the 19th century. One of the first issues, in fact, in creating a standard language is to figure out the relationship of dialects and to select a dialect base. Different dialect features span across South Slavic territories, and there are clusters of features of dialects. And what I mean by that are how certain sounds developed or how certain verb forms evolved. These features make some dialects closer and more easily comprehended by different speakers than other, more distant dialects. So during the debates in Bulgaria on dialects that would serve as the basis of a Bulgarian standard language, The most frequently cited problem for a unified language was the differences between Macedonian dialects in the West and Bulgarian dialects in the East. Bulgarians argue that Macedonia shares a number of features with it. Well, yes, that's true. Macedonia also shares a bunch of features with English. It also shares different features with Serbian. It shares a number of syntactic features with non-Slavic Balkan languages like Albanian, Greek, or Romani. That, in fact, is what languages do when they're developing and when they're in contact with other languages, and when they develop out of, say, the same Slavic stuff that developed from Proto-Indo-European. But because Macedonia remained under Ottoman domination longer than either Bulgaria or Serbia, and since it was located at the center of territory claimed both geographically and linguistically by Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece, it was the slowest in establishing a separate language and state. Its development was impeded by political events and policies in these neighboring countries. And as a result, Macedonian was, in comparison with neighboring territories, late in standardizing. Now, this fact that Macedonian was a later standardizing language within the South Slavic dialect continuum does not make its own processes of standardization either any different or any less real than the languages that went through language codification earlier. There are those who would like to promote a revisionist history in which Macedonia as a separate language didn't exist until the 1940s. This has been stated so often that it's become accepted, and it gets repeated over and over again by people who are too lazy to open up the archives or to read academic works and read the works of people seeking to write in their own vernacular, their own language. The whole point of Ausbau situations is that dialect continua can develop multiple centers around which different standard languages coalesce. So as a result of this complex process of standardization, the long-standing separate traditions of East and West led ultimately to two separate standard languages. And those differences began already in the Middle Ages. The awareness of Macedonian difference and recognition of Macedonian as an evolving standard language was certainly present by the 1870s when Georgi Pulevsky published his trilingual dictionary. It was certainly present when Kirster Misarkov wrote on Macedonian Matters in 1903. It was certainly present by the time of partition in 1913, by which time early works had been published by Kurchovsky, Pecinovich, Konstantin Dzinov, Kuzman Shapkarev, and others, all basing their works on Macedonian dialects. The interwar years saw numerous attempts to develop a standard, and these were consistently suppressed by Serbian, Bulgarian, and Greek interests. Macedonians were continually forced to be educated in and to write in other languages. In the early 20th century, new circumstances arose that allowed Macedonians to choose Macedonian. Writers began to write in Macedonian, and speakers began to use Macedonian in multiple new domains because it was their language. So why is this relevant today? Well, now that we see that Macedonian has a standard language that began to develop at least by the mid-19th century, but due to political reasons wasn't fully codified and used in all public life in Macedonia until the mid-20th century, a lot went down in the 20th century that has repercussions for the teaching of Macedonian in diaspora. I would argue that the history of partition created particular impediments to the acquisition and acceptance of the standard language and an understanding of the networks of connection between dialect and standard. In order to develop teaching materials and language courses, the first question we need to ask is, what do I want the outcome to be for my students? At the University of Toronto, I considered that my desired outcome was to create proficient speakers who had knowledge in reading, writing, speaking, and understanding the Macedonian standard language, coupled with cultural knowledge. What do I mean by cultural knowledge? Knowledge of Macedonian history and artists and writers and musicians and geography and filmmakers, and cultural knowledge of rituals and traditions, how you welcome newborns, how you bury the dead, how you celebrate holidays, how to make traditional foods, what do you do when you get the coin at Christmas or New Year's? Over the course of my 30 years at the University of Toronto, these goals became somewhat elastic. In part, my shifting views were a result of the growth in teaching materials and new technologies. We could do more types of things, and students could be exposed to more real-life language situations, and they could hear more language variation. And in part, it had to do with my growing realization that for many of my students, their primary interest was oral communication, both with family and with other Macedonians. I began to develop a more fluid acceptance of dialect forms in the classroom. I know my former students who are listening today will roll their eyes when they recall the numerous times I pointed out these systematic relations between dialects and how they could use their advanced knowledge of those differences to become bidialectal. That is, use standard language in formal settings and written settings, and local dialect in familial and more intimate settings. This would, I felt, this understanding of the interrelationship and the language ecology would help bridge the communicative gap across dialects and generations in the diaspora. The more I learned about the dialect histories of my students, and I had a model that would strengthen both knowledge of standard and appreciation of traditional dialects. And that language ecology is, I believe, healthy for language in diaspora. When students would tell me that there were words in my textbook that their grandparents didn't know, I had to get them to see how the introduction of new words like mikrobranova pečka, microwave oven, would of course be new words that their grandmothers didn't know. That the rich local landscape of the village was not the landscape of an urban technological country in the 21st century. But the ideal goal is to have language that allows for both landscapes. Which leads me to my next point. There is a lot of anxiety among heritage language speakers, not just of Macedonian, but any language. I've spoken with students at the University of Toronto about how extremely difficult it has been in their families to pass on a heritage language in an English-speaking diaspora. But rather than despairing, I would like people to recognize that any language is better than no language. More language is better than a little language. I've been thinking, and I was thinking about this in preparing for my talk today, about thinking about the home culture and the diaspora culture as, if you will, two land masses. Just work with me here, I think in terms of metaphor. So imagine we have our heritage thing and we have our English language thing, and these are these two land masses. And it would be nice if those two land masses were connected by the superhighway of full bilingualism. But if there's no language, the two land masses, between those two land masses, these two different cultures remain difficult to bridge. Every word learned in the heritage language is like a stepping stone dropped in the water, helping to make movement across. More language is more stones, stronger bridge. I've begun work on a project that I'm calling Symbolic Heritage Language, which was inspired in part by the Macedonian community in Toronto, which has been so supportive of my work, in part by the excellent study at intergenerational Macedonian in Australia by Jim Plavac, and Elena Petruska's work on Macedonians in the United States. I've come to appreciate how second, third, and fourth generation speakers actually know more language than they think, but they have become so conditioned to lamenting their lack of high-speed transit across that they fail to see the rich value in the stepping stones that they do have. Words like baba, dedo, budala, kum, nunko, zelnik, čestiti, da mu je lesna zemlja to, Bog da go prosti, alal ti je, šoprajš, spolajti, fala. These are rich cultural markers that deeply resonate across generations. When students tell me that they speak broken Macedonian, or they speak village Macedonian or hillbilly Macedonian, I counter that, first of all, in diaspora, languages are in contact, and the intermixing of Macedonian and English is a natural phenomenon. And while it's not fluent Macedonian, it is still fluent intergenerational communication because everyone around them is code switching. The goal should be to build out from these first stepping stones to allow a stronger use of Macedonian and a deeper appreciation of the rich symbolic value of any linguistic and cultural knowledge. So how does this deeper linguistic knowledge of Macedonian happen? That's what you've all been waiting for. Macedonian parents, grandparents, and their children actually feel shame about not passing on their linguistic heritage. Study after study in Toronto among multiple linguistic communities has demonstrated how actually difficult this is for parents who are working super hard to then have to try and figure out how to teach their children. This is particularly true when there are not numerous and rich networks of people speaking that same language on a daily basis in the home. My preliminary research on symbolic heritage language points, not unsurprisingly, to the significant role that Babas played in cultural and linguistic transfer of knowledge. When a grandmother who didn't speak English took care of the children, there was early intergenerational transfer, not only of language, but of foods, customs, and beliefs as well. Parents have often feared that their children would be left behind if they didn't speak to them in English. But study after study shows again that because English is so ubiquitous, children will pick it up outside the home, they'll pick it up through schooling, they'll pick it up through media. But if one parent or someone in the family speaks only in Macedonian to the child, it will aid the child in early language acquisition. Beyond language in the home, there are other ways of language enrichment through songs, language courses that occur in some public schools. It's being offered in Toronto public schools this summer, church language programs, movies, online media, shows like Familieta Markovski that appeal to older learners. Again, some language is better than no language. If early frameworks are in place, children have a better chance of using those bits of language they have, and if they need it later on, they already have the rudimentary stepping stones for building a more solid knowledge of their heritage language. So what might a model look like for the future? When we look across North America, for example, we actually see fewer and fewer courses in Macedonia as university budgets tighten and with the retirements of a number of Macedonian specialists, and I include here Victor Friedman and myself. There are glimmers of hope, however. I point to the intensive summer course like that Keith Brown at the Critical Languages Institute at Arizona State University brought back this year, and which Borja Arcef has 7 students who are learning in an online environment this summer. Previously, it was taught in the summer at other universities like Pittsburgh and Indiana. The Macedonian Summer Seminar in Ohrid through the University of Cyril and Methodius provided grants for some of my students to attend the seminar, and community support in Toronto helped the students with airfare. In fact, community partnerships are critical. The University of Toronto's course was only made possible due to the long-standing support of Canadian Macedonian Place and numerous contributions to the financial stability of the course. While ideally we would have students in classrooms locally, one of the outcomes of the COVID crisis is that we may be able to build new kinds of networks. We may be able to create courses that combine synchronous, real-time, and asynchronous, not real-time, learning across universities. Participation in summer school courses can perhaps be diversified, allowing for both distance and local learning. But these things don't happen without support. Another example of this is the Macedonian e-learning center. Any of you gone online to play Koisaka de Vida Millionaire? Just asking. Biljana Belomiric-Wilsey has created lots of free materials over the past decade for younger learners all the way through more advanced, but all of that material will be lost when flash technology is no longer accessible. Someone needs to help because it costs a lot of money to adapt materials to a new platform. I know, it's happened to me. Liliana Mitkovska and Maria Kusevska have excellent teaching materials for English language learners through their Zborua Telemakedonski course. It was difficult to attain but has become more accessible through the accessing online of PDF versions. Distribution makes it difficult to acquire materials without someone traveling to Macedonia or sneaking photocopies. Better distribution of books, films, dictionaries would help. But in the end, we need to work with Macedonian communities and different educational institutions to create networks of learning, while also building the desire among different kinds of speakers, different kinds of students, Macedonian and not Macedonian, to engage more with the Macedonian language. Thank you. That's what I want to say first.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Christina. And I definitely think you answered a lot of the audience questions that were submitted before this event. And please, everybody that's participating, feel free to type in your questions in the chat room with Zoom, and we'll make sure to try to answer as many as possible tonight. But you know, Christina, I think it's great that you brought up the Baba in that relationship, because that's actually how I learned Macedonian language. You know, growing up, my Baba lived with us, and so we got to practice, and we picked up the Prilepski or Krushevski dialect, and then my dad would constantly complain, but we're from, you know, I'm from Kičevo, and you don't have the Kičevo dialect, you know, and so they would always have competition between my mom and my dad about which dialect is the better dialect to speak. And it's interesting because I think that the dialectal, I mean, it adds so much richness to our culture. But, you know, I'd love to maybe get more, I guess, your thoughts on how do we, you know, like there's a question from Anna Maria Kaleszowski from Toronto, and kind of brings up similar, is that, you know, our culture is part of our identity. And for those of us who are first generation and like myself, born here in the US, I would say that being surrounded by our parents, grandparents, and family members have helped to keep these traditions and our language alive. As we continue to balance these traditions and adopting to our current surrounding culture, what's some advice that you give us for us to kind of ensure that our Macedonian culture and language is passed on onto other generations ahead of us, I guess?
Well, first, I'm sorry. I just have to say that my father was from New York and my mother was from Boston. So I know the problem of competing dialects in the household.
Oh.
I say aunt and tomato, just for the record, but half of my siblings say tomato and aunt. So these things are things that happen in every language.
Yes.
I don't allow my husband to say some words because he's from Chicago, and I didn't want my children to have a Chicago accent. So, and I say this in part tongue-in-cheek, but also the fact that Macedonian and the experiences that Macedonian has and interdialect contact is a feature of every language. And unless you're in a village and that village is used to marrying within one other village, and then you're still going to have competing dialects. But in answer to the question, the only way it's going to happen is to use it. And that is so much easier said than done. But every piece is better than no piece. And the use of words and the engagement and seeing that your children see you and they hear you speaking another language. I think when children are aware from the earliest age that there's more than one language, there's more that goes on than English. And it's not just old people who speak some weird language, that they see intergenerational people engaging in fun ways and very serious ways with their heritage language. Sometimes that gets transferred through culture that is spoken in English, or it is passed through English with token and symbolic words in Macedonian. I would prefer, if it were my children, that they were actually speaking in Macedonian and responding in Macedonian. But I know for many of you whose names I see, you understood a lot of language passively, but responded in English. And that too is a very typical cross-linguistic phenomenon of more than one language in the household. But that receptive bilingualism, that ability to take in Macedonian and understand it, is already such a huge leap forward in eventual acquisition of Macedonian. So I'd say the more language you could use, the more different ways you can build language into the home environment, the more exposure children have of seeing people engaging with Macedonian, the more likely it is that you're going to be successful in a home setting to pass on more bits of that language.
Definitely, definitely. And you know, going to Australia, for example, one of our UMD Australia board members, Vera Sekulovsky from Sydney, Australia, you know, she agrees that the ideal time to naturally learn a language is when a child is very young. However, obviously, as you said, you know, with children born in the diaspora, we often encourage the mainstream language prior to the start of school. You know, and I mean, I know from example, you know, try to, you know, speak Macedonian at home. You'll learn it. You'll learn English at school. Whereas some, you know, shun that and sort of say, you know, we need to speak English only. You need to learn it and all that. And so, you know, in Australia, they actually offer, you know, schools and weekend classes and courses. And so, you know, would we benefit or, you know, is it a disadvantage for our diaspora children by exposing them to the Macedonian language prior to the mainstream? You know, I want to make sure we kind of like drill on this point that, I mean, I think it's a benefit, but, you know, some see it as a disadvantage.
It's totally not a disadvantage. Every study comes in that early bilingualism is better. Early bilingualism is actually a phenomenon that happens all over the world. People live in very complex linguistic environments. That said, my Macedonian's not bad. I did not hear a word of Macedonian until I was 18, when I learned some songs and didn't know what they meant. And then I got interested and I went on to learn Macedonian, and I speak Macedonian not badly, but certainly not natively. And that took place in my 20s. So I also don't want to fetishize and say, if you missed the boat and your parents taught you in English, and gosh, what a loss, and my parents were losers, they should have forced me to speak Macedonian at home. If you want to learn it, you can make tremendous strides when you're an adult. You're going to have an accent. Oh well, neyse. There are worse things, but you'll be able to communicate. So yes, earlier is better, more earlier is better. You don't need to be afraid of bilingualism. Kids sort it out. Some of my nieces and nephews are bilingual because they were early bilinguals in English and German, or English and Italian, English and Russian. I didn't know any language than English until my adulthood. So I just want to encourage people to remember, early is better, but it's not the end of the universe.
It's funny you mentioned that because you know, when I was growing up, I actually was in ESL, even though I was born in the United States, but because we spoke so much Macedonian, English was obviously my second language, and so it took a while to actually perfect my English. Because of that, but I definitely think it was an added benefit, and obviously, you know, now as a result of that, you can understand other Balkan languages. And our board member Trajko Papuchkovsky, actually, who lives in Dallas, took Macedonian, I think, a course at Indiana University, and now he has two, you know, very small toddlers, I think around 2 years old, and he's, you know, wondering like what are the resources available, and you touched on this, and I know you'll touch on it more, but something that I've seen, and two things that I've seen is, one, obviously the Macedonian Language E-Learning Center. I think those, the books, the tutorials that Biljana, that you mentioned, does through the website. And then the other thing is this kind of innovative, creative way of Darko Biberko. I don't know if you've seen these videos on YouTube. Yeah. Where Nev and Kalina Neshkoska create these videos for children. I would say primarily under 5, because I think they're very, for toddlers and before they're in kindergarten. But like, are there any other resources that, or how can we further develop resources for that age range, perhaps?
Well, I know that there have been books developed, various alphabet books. There's some beautiful books in Macedonia. I've seen stuff coming out of Australia. I know that Biljana's worked on it. The internet really is an amazing universe. There is a lot out on YouTube. Other ways of introducing the alphabet. Some people, I've had students who convert all of their media to be Macedonian. So anytime they're on their phone or they're on their computer, they're in a Macedonian universe and they have to read Macedonian and Cyrillic to be able to click the right buttons. So I think that having there be games to learn, so that learning isn't, okay, now you're going to have to go to Sunday school, you're going to have to go to after language school, which is great, but I've heard over so many years resistance, because it normally starts at an age when kids are resistant to learning, pre-adolescent years, teenage years. But what's been more successful are students who have enjoyed Macedonian cultural activities that provide language contact. So I don't know who else is developing online learning tools and books, but with community involvement, there are people who could certainly be developing this sort of thing. Children's programming in Macedonia has developed a huge amount since 30 years ago. And if those programs were more readily broadcast and people able to watch them at home, I think you could create, it has to be attractive. It can't be like, now it's the medicine because you're Macedonian and you need to take this medicine. It has to be, here's something really fun. And getting to speak Macedonian and reading Macedonian gives you something extra, and it's different, and it's like having a secret code. It's sort of magical.
What about those that are of Macedonian heritage, but their, parents, grandparents didn't pass on the language, and let's say they're not, the young Macedonians are not interested in learning it at all. How would one kind of promote it and spark interest in young generation, I guess the next generation? And this comes from one of our Generation M team members, Elena, from Melbourne, Australia.
Well, I love the question, because the thing about language is where language is easiest is natural intergenerational transfer of language. And we know from numerous situations, very tragic situations in the world, certainly in Canada, for example, the breaking of intergenerational transfer of language through residential schooling, for example, and Indigenous languages being lost through policies that did not allow the generational transfer. The problem of language study in the Balkans and what happened in Aegean Macedonia was the breaking of intergenerational transfer of language. So I think if children can be made aware of the richness of what it is to have a second language, and I'm not saying we need to sit down 3-year-old children and tell them that the politics of intergenerational transfer has been broken and so they'd better get with the program.
Sure.
I think to create an awareness of how cool it is and how amazing it is, and that they are the carriers of that language forward. And even, and I say this, and I think in part I was inspired by this when I began thinking about this notion of symbolic heritage language. I was looking for something in the library that might shed light on this, and there was a book about Yiddish called Language in a Post-Vernacular Environment, and talking about all the different ways in which Yiddish was revitalized, even though the vastly diminished communities of native Yiddish speakers. And it talked about all these things of music and song and cultural events and cultural festivals as sort of a cultural revival, which pulled along with it language revival. And I know from my students, even if they don't speak Macedonian all the time, their deep engagement with, for some students, it's been Macedonian sport, Macedonian students clubs, Macedonian folk dancing, Macedonian political organizations, some way to engage, and I hate to say it, some way to engage with Macedonian and Macedonian speakers who aren't just in the family.
Well, what would be fascinating, and I remember when I went to Macedonia and I would hang out with my cousins, and then some friends, and they would be talking in Spanish, and I'm like, how'd you learn Spanish? And they're like, the telenovela, the Spanish soap operas on TV.
Yep.
And wouldn't it be awesome if there was like a Macedonian equivalent telenovela on Netflix or Amazon Prime, right? We would be able to watch this and practice our Macedonian, or at least read it, and then obviously, practice it through that.
Well, Familia Tamarkovsky, which you at least for a while could watch on YouTube. I don't know if I haven't looked yet for the next season. Again, is engaging. It is plot driven. Mm-hmm. A lot of, it's really hard when you're teaching Macedonian to find something that's plot driven, where students are going, what happens next? And instead, it's really so hard when you're learning a language and you're trying to get through literature and it's 3 pages of description and you're just, you're lost. And so things that are just totally motivating. That's why Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? It sounds so silly, but I got hooked on it. I couldn't stop playing and answering the questions. And I haven't won $1 million yet, man. But it's engaging. It brings you in, and it allows you to play with language. So language is really fun and not a chore to make someone else happy. It's really driven from your internal desire to learn it.
Well, I want to, so we're getting a lot of questions in the chat room, and I'm going to try to get or combine some of them. You mentioned the Aegean dialects, and so questions sort of like go hand in hand, but Emily Branoff from Toronto, Canada, according to your expertise, what is to come of the village dialects of Aegean Macedonians? And then Vera, back to Vera from Australia, she added, have there been any comparison studies conducted into the various dialects of Macedonian within Macedonia to the way Macedonians speak and developed it, I guess, in the diaspora community?
That is such an awesome question, and I should know the answer, and I'm just drawing a complete blank. I know that Elena Petroska did work on young people's speech in Macedonia and also has done work on diaspora language. I know there's certainly a lot of work in diaspora. For example, Jim Plavac's study, Peter Hill has done research on it, Ilya Chashul has done research on it. I've written about dialect speakers in the classroom, so I know about diaspora studies. If somebody is on this call who knows of work in Macedonia looking out to dialect use in diaspora, I'd be really interested in knowing what the sources are. I just don't happen to know them. As for the Aegean dialect, we could say the same for dialects in general, that one of the fallouts of language standardization, and it certainly happened with English. I mean, English is such a weird language because it really began to be standardized in the 15th century. So we think that's always been standard, but it hasn't. And as a standard language rises, what used to all be different dialects starts being the dialect that became the standard kind of starts rising, and the other languages start being viewed not as equal dialects. They start being looked at as pejorative, selski, rather than we all speak a dialect. In point of fact, all of us speak differently, and we carry with us these traces of our home dialect. And my New England speech has carried with me, even though I no longer live there. And it takes about a minute and a half when someone hears me speak in Canada, though I've been here more than half my life, to say, you're from away. So these dialect features, even when we speak standard, these are part of our idiolect and the part of the way that we bring forward the languages and the way of speaking and the manner of speaking of our particular heritage and our particular relatives. So part of the legacy of Aegean Macedonian dialects in diaspora is vocabulary, it is certain ways of saying things, it's having a nunco, it's saying spoliti. So even at the most, I know this sounds very inconsequential, but I think that these cultural markers are a handshake across generations that say, you're one of my people.
Definitely.
And I think it would be an awesome thing to actually have teaching materials that allow people to learn their dialect together with the standard language. Because when you can start making the correlations and you understand what's happening in the dialect and what's happening in the standard, it gives you that key to both worlds.
So I love, you literally answered the next question, but I'll sort of mention it anyway, and maybe we could elaborate perhaps. But UMD member Tammy Josifovich from Chicago, she sort of said like her Macedonian is the version that her great grandparents spoke, and she's often told it's staro or chisto, and sometimes feels that it's just a secret family language. Speaking to other Macedonians can be sometimes hard to understand, and it's easier for her to just say, I only speak English. From a linguistic perspective, should we keep the old language alive or try to learn the most recent? And is there a benefit? And do you have suggestions on bridging the language differences between different Macedonian generations of the diaspora? And just to add on here, I think sort of similar on that point of the English is like one of our members, Peter Zarowski from Washington, he goes with its phonetic spelling, definite articles, and almost no cases. Is Macedonian the easiest Slavic language for an English speaker to learn?
I'm just going to give a quick thumbs up here, but we'll take them one at a time. So first of all, not every language gets to have a standard language. That for a community to be able to create a standard language is a big deal. And that big deal is that in that language ecology, it creates a meta language for cross-dialectal communication. And it allows an expansion of this compromised system to be a meta language so that we don't need to reproduce a dictionary for every dialect. We don't need to have every writer writing in their own dialect. The school system can actually use common materials. So a standard language is a really convenient thing to have in a contemporary industrial public education community. So I don't want to say give up on learning the standard language, because the fact that Macedonian, after a long and hard struggle, actually managed to have a standard language is totally awesome, totally useful, and really significantly important. That said, if people can be bilingual, they can totally be bidialectal. And I've made the analogy many times that you have no problem dressing up and dressing down.
Mm-hmm.
I have a little problem dressing up, but it's okay. Dressing up and dressing down, and that's what we do with language. And to have language that is the intimate sphere, and we can speak our dialect, let our hair down if we have hair that we can let down, and use the intimate dialect of our home and the standard language for formal communication, that in some ways is ideal. Short of that, everyone needs to appreciate this language ecology of all these dialects that interact. And instead of going, oh my God, I hate the way you say that word, couldn't it be that is so completely awesome that you say puli?
Yeah.
And I say gleda, but you say puli? That is awesome. Hey, do you know why you say leboy and I say lebovi? It's because v disappeared interdialectally, intervocalically. So when we start seeing the coordination, the way these things are in dialect, and dialectic and in dialogue with one another, it starts being really cool. Oh, you say it this way and I say it that way, and not you do not speak the real language, because it's all the real language. And all that real language, these words come up from the dialects into the standard. They go down from the standard into the dialect. Words come in from other languages. That's how language functions as a multivalent system. And so I would love the person in Chicago to say to people when they go, you speak Staro or Chisto, the answer should be, you betcha. And you might be interested to know that where my people come from are this region, and this is why I have a little bit of difficulty understanding you. Or for years I'd hear people say, I really don't understand the news when I hear it. News is really hard to understand if it's not your native language. So it's not just the formal register. It has to do with intonation patterns and speed. It has to do with verbal cues. And when speakers of goodwill can figure out a way across the standard dialect and dialect to dialect divide, language becomes really fun. It's
Definitely.
totally awesome. I mean, the first time I learned that soba was an oven, and so my students thought that they're going into the oven and not to the room. I mean, that was just mind-blowing. It was just awesome learning the relationship and the way words moved across meaning as they traveled across time and space.
My baba used to say soba for the oven in the village in Belica. So I'm gonna combine a few questions.
Okay.
One is Andrew Minas from Melbourne. How were you able to get your textbook so widely distributed to Australia and beyond in 1999 and afterwards, when Macedonian language resources in the West were almost non-existent? So adding to that, Robert Newsies from Toronto just recently purchased your Macedonian textbook, third edition. And so his question is, do you have any tips or suggestions for anyone who is trying to self-teach Macedonian to themselves, especially people that were more proficient when they were younger and then sort of lost it onwards? And then Laura Cosinau from Canada, how do you recommend one practice if they have very little time and few people they feel comfortable speaking within Macedonia?
What was that last question?
So it's how do you recommend one practice if they have very little time and few people they feel comfortable speaking within Macedonia?
Okay, so these are related questions, so we'll take them one by one. What happened with the Macedonian textbook is really kind of a strange story. I was teaching Macedonian, and there were, as you said, there were really no language books for English language learners. Ilya Chashula had started writing one in Australia, and I had a couple of those chapters. And then I began working with this excellent, really quite excellent Macedonian Italian textbook. I unfortunately forget the name of the author. And I began writing English language grammatical explanations to go along with the Italian Macedonian exercises in the classroom. It was kind of a crazy language situation. around 1999, Steve Salemson at University of Wisconsin contacted me saying that Victor Friedman had told him that I had a Macedonian textbook that I was working on, and University of Wisconsin Press would like to publish it. This was nothing I had ever anticipated sharing outside of the classroom. In Toronto, I was really writing it for my students. But right around this time, of course, there was conflict happening in the Balkans, and there were requests from all sorts of NGOs for Macedonian learning materials. And so the first edition of the textbook really zoomed into print. I think it had 1,000 typos in it, typographical errors, because it all just happened very fast. University of Wisconsin Press just really worked with me and shepherded that book to its first incarnation. The second edition really, Liliana Mitkovska worked with me. I worked really hard on that second edition to produce something that I thought met the needs of a broader community. And in the third edition, we added more materials, more different kinds of exercises, and really expanded language variation in the third edition. The way it traveled, all I can think of is that I was working with an established university press. And University of Wisconsin had the ability to, they had a book distributor. The books weren't being sold. I didn't handle selling books from my living room. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but a lot of times in Macedonia, it is that small of an operation that the books get published, but there's no money for distribution. So university presses are not exactly flush with cash, but the university press system, I think, was able to advertise. The book got picked up, of course, by international distributors, and I think that's how the book was distributed so widely when other materials weren't available. As for working through the textbook on your own, again, telling you sort of the history of this book was really written with the students at the University of Toronto in mind. It is a Macedonian textbook that takes place in Toronto. They go to the University of Toronto. The family lives right around the corner from my house on Garden Street. So it was this very local project that then grew to become sort of, I have heard from every last continent of people using the book. That includes, I've heard people from South Africa. I've heard of people in Brazil using the book. So in a lot of ways, it wasn't designed for self-study. But we then realized a lot of people were using it for self-study. So we put the answer key in there. I have answered questions when people write to me and they say, I really can't figure this thing out in chapter whatever. I'll answer you. It takes, I think that the book is workable for self-learning, but learning a language takes a tremendous amount of discipline. So I would arrange, if you're working through it on your own, to find an interlocutor, somebody you can call once a week and talk, even if you're doing it through Zoom or whatever, somebody who will talk you through the exercises or talk about the dialogues, talk about the characters, so that you get a chance to actually use the vocabulary and use the structures in a meaningful way with each chapter. The same thing for how do you maintain a language when you don't have people to practice it with. Those of us who work on multiple languages, this is the constant problem. First of all, we have to get over our fear of using the language with people when we don't know the language well. I tell people, if you know 10 words, try to use 12. And if you know 14 words, try to use 18. Try to figure out a way to keep pushing forward what you are willing to do. If you are in quarantine, I know it's so hard to imagine. Imagine that you actually can't leave your house and go anywhere. This is a mind experiment. What we really can do, we can do actually a lot of work by reading, and we can do a lot of work by listening. People will set themselves up every morning, I'm going to get up and I'm going to read a news story. And they get up day one and they read a news story, and they get up on day two and they go, that was kind of hard, so maybe I'm going to skip today, but I'll get back to it tomorrow. We set up absolutely impossible goals for ourselves. Instead, if you said, every day, I'm going to listen to my 3 favorite Macedonian songs, and I'm going to try and memorize the words. Every day, I'm going to open up a Macedonian website or a Macedonian social media feed, and I'm going to try and read a paragraph. If we establish these teeny tiny goals, we actually can do them. And then that 2 sentences a day might become 4 sentences. And 4 sentences might become a paragraph. And a paragraph might become a whole news story. Another thing I have done to keep my language and vocabulary building going, you're probably going to be shocked when I tell you this, but I've been trying to learn Albanian for, I think I'm up to 25 years, 30 years, 40 years. I find it a very difficult language to learn. But I'll take a news story online and I'll dump it into a Word document, and then I'll dump it into Google Translate by paragraph, and then I take the translation, and I've got 2 electronic sheets of paper, and I read, and when I get stuck, I slide the paper out from underneath. And it gives me a way to work my way forward. And if I get stuck, it helps me get unstuck. So Google Translate isn't going to give you a perfect, beautiful translation. And sometimes it goes way off the rails, but it's often enough, good enough, that it can really help you leverage your reading skills up.
Well,
yep.
No, thank you. And I think translations are probably one of the best ways you can learn the language. I mean, when I was taking French, I would do that. I would take French materials, translate them, Google Translate, and then learn, the vocabulary, the grammar, all that through that. And obviously the courses helped, but definitely you have to have initiative on your own as well.
Good dictionaries, very helpful.
Yes.
Again, I've hand carried, I think, 5 of these back from Macedonia because I can't get them here.
Well, Rečnik, I think there's a website called Rečnik.ma or whatnot, and people can easily, and obviously Google Translate is good. I mean, it doesn't translate fully the best. It's interesting. One of the people in the chat Belinda mentioned that she worked, I guess, through Twitter. When you would write in Macedonian, Twitter would automatically translate it, or like Bulgarian or Serbian. They would say it's Bulgarian or Serbian. And so apparently Belinda worked through the Human Rights Commission of Australia and got Twitter to change this. So now it's Macedonian. When you write Macedonian, it says this was translated as Macedonian. So thank you, Belinda, for bringing that up, and kudos for taking that action, that successful action. Biljana corrected me. There is a tutorial, I guess, a children's material, Makedonski Narodni Prikazni, on YouTube. And so you can definitely find those and practice. And we're actually planning on doing a Macedonian language e-learning center program for children with Biljana on weekends for about 30 minutes for children under 10 years old. So anybody that is interested, stay tuned to our social media about that. There's a couple of more questions, and I think we'll wrap it up. One is, Duolingo. And UMD member Alex Popovsky from Florida mentioned this. If Duolingo can host language courses in Navajo and why not in Macedonian? Or let's add, what about Rosetta Stone? The program, there's no Macedonian available through that, right? There's no, probably the major language programs in the world don't offer Macedonian. And so how do we, what can we do? What can UMD as an organization do to help get more programs like that and talk with Duolingo and others to have Macedonian language courses? It's a really awesome question. Before I attempt an answer, I typed in, it should be www.makedonski.info is an online dictionary.
someone asked, but I grabbed, I'm in the process of translating a novel, and I shot a link which is to a specific word. So, but you will be able to find your way into the online dictionary.
Thank you.
So remember, these things like Duolingo, or there are others, and I know there are some for Macedonian. I can't think of the names of them. They take personal initiative. They don't just happen. So it's not like someone saying, let's never do Macedonian. It comes the other way around. Someone has to say, let's do Macedonian. And those initiatives, we can't rely on pro bono work, because the technology is expensive. And to create a Duolingo, I mean, I would love to know who has actually successfully learned a language with Duolingo, but it sort of doesn't matter because Duolingo is actually lots of fun. When I thought I was going to give a paper in Japan, I began Duolingo Japanese, and it was loads of fun. I don't know how much Japanese I learned, but it's okay. I learned Hangul, and that was sufficient unto the day. But I think if there were people who were interested in expanding things like that, and they were willing to put together a team of people that had professionals who could vet the language so that the language that was going up on Duolingo was correct, and there was at least an honorarium, if not an hourly wage. When I did the multilingual, the multimedia DVD for Macedonian for the first and second edition, there was some support, not a lot of support. It cost, I raised $3,000 to create it. Phil Hammonds and Grace Fielder donated time, small honorarium. It took 5,000 hours. And then when the platform changed, those 5,000 hours disappeared because it was no longer updatable. So new platforms are changing, and they're making it easier for people to do this, but it's going to take private and community partnerships to bring together specialists to do it. It takes initiative. I don't think there's anything saying that it can't happen, but it's going to take that combination, that bringing together of people to make it happen.
Thank you. Thank you, Christina. And I think, why don't we perhaps, last question, tying into what you were talking about, and this is something I think that is sort of like a burning question amongst Macedonians. You know, the problem with sometimes in our community is we don't miss it until it's gone. And, you know, Macquarie, I believe, University in Australia had Macedonian language. Mm-hmm. You know, University of Toronto, I mean, you're retired now, but University of Toronto had Macedonian language. Mm-hmm. Indiana University, you know, Arizona State University dropped it, and now it's back as a critical language, you know, mm-hmm. in the Language Institute, but that's as a result of a Macedonian, the Mary Chonchov endowment, who was a Macedonian librarian at Arizona State University, who her family created an endowment fund to fund its language program. And now they've received extra funding, so they're able to put it back up, right? And obviously the Macedonian language, you know, .org website, which is an online, you know, which still exists, thankfully, but like, what can we do? Is there a possibility, you know, as Dr. Chris Stefanovic asks, is like, is there a role for teaching Macedonian again at the University of Toronto, at these other universities? What is your call to action to all of us here tonight, in the morning in Australia, following us on what we can do as United Macedonian Diaspora, Generation M, other organizations that exist in the diaspora? What can we do to make your life easier?
So it's a great question, but I want to just back up and say it's not. So what happened at University of Toronto is actually a very different, in some ways very different than the situation at Macquarie or other universities. So University of Toronto hired a young Slavic linguist, moi, to come and teach Russian and Slavic linguistics. And in my job talk, which was on my dissertation, which was about Macedonian, they learned that my other Slavic language was Macedonian, and the community organized to create the possibility of giving the Slavic department money, which released enough of my time so that I could teach Macedonian. So it was a very specific, it came out of the person they hired and not an a priori thing saying what we really need at University of Toronto is the teaching of Macedonian. And in a department like the Slavic departments across North America, when there are demands to teach a whole constellation, more languages than, say, a Romance language department, Russian, Polish, Ukrainian, Bulgarian, Macedonian, Serbian, Croatian, Slovak, they can't do it all. So if there's community support, both financially and in terms of student engagement, it may be possible to get a course. So when I was a faculty member, it was really easy because nobody had to pay enough money to get me to Toronto, to pay my salary, to give me enough money so that I could pay rent. So if you wanted to just bring someone over from Macedonia and you say, well, we're going to give you $15,000 to teach a class, they can't live on it. It's impossible. So you start running into structural difficulties in teaching the class. When I was talking about possibilities post-COVID of reimagining how we might do it and imagining scenarios where intensive courses in the summer may be more cost effective because students aren't trying to do all their course credits, their lab sciences, their thises and their that's, but they could devote maybe an intensive summer period. And maybe there could be local university courses taught in one place, but that are also then networked through a network of universities offering intensive language courses. Maybe those could then couple with in-country programs or tie-ins to the Critical Language Institute. But a lot of it's going to involve ways in figuring out how money moves across institutions to make local and distance learning possible. But I think we are in kind of this wonky moment of being able to reimagine different kinds of course delivery. Ideally, we would have students in the university setting, in the classroom, in real-time communicative settings. That's ideal. And then moving that to in-country experience. But if we can't do that, I think we should think about what could we do to think outside the box and get community members willing to sit and cross with university personnel to discuss what could a new course delivery look like that could be both cost effective and broad networking out. Or Chris could make me 30 years younger if he knows how to do that, and I'll come do it again.
Excellent. Love it. Love it. Well, Christina, I believe this was an amazing, went a lot over than the original plan, but obviously you're very passionate on the topic. We're very interested in the topic as Macedonian heritage speakers, learners. What I didn't even see the pin.
Zdravets.
Oh, wonderful. Well, the national flower of Macedonia and the logo of the Canadian Macedonian place. And I want to, thank them for playing such a critical role in helping out the Macedonian language program at University of Toronto, and to all of our community members there. But I definitely think this is a call to action to all of us. It's very important that we work to promote and further the Macedonian language abroad, and figure out ways to collaborate with folks back in the homeland to further language instruction even more. So thank you very much, Christina, for your lifelong dedication to the study of the Macedonian language. Like I said, your Christina Kramer is the synonym for the study of the Macedonian language abroad. And so thank you again, Christina.
I am just putting my email in here. I know people, there are some other questions coming in, and I'm just throwing in my email, and people can send me an email and I'll answer.
Oh, well, that's very, very kind of you to do that. And those of you that are following in the chat, Christina's email is there, and feel free to communicate. And I'm loving this engagement between the speaker and the audience. With that, I want to thank all of our viewers. I want to remind everybody that next week, actually next Monday, same time, my colleague Christina Dimitrievsky, who's the Generation M Young Leaders Program Global Co-Chair, is hosting an event with Susan Sloan, who's the author of A Seat at the Table, Women, Diplomacy, and Lessons for the World. That's on June 29th. And then our popular Macedonian Trivia Night is back. Mario Christovsky and Nick Tsarovsky on Thursday, July 16th. So mark your calendars and definitely stay tuned to announce from a Macedonian language e-learning center children's program on how to learn the Macedonian language. So thank you, Christina, once again, and thank you to all that came on our call tonight. Have a wonderful night and a day in Australia. Pozdrav.
Pozdrav. Ciao.
Ciao, ciao.